I spent 11 years being the quiet one. The one who showed up early, stayed late, kept the peace, swallowed the insults, and smiled through the family dinners where I was treated like a temporary guest in a house I helped keep standing. I was 39 years old, sitting in a courtroom with cold fluorescent lights humming above me, and the woman across the aisle was pointing her finger at me, telling the judge that every document I had filed was a lie. She said I was a forger. She said I had manipulated a sick old man. She said I had stolen what did not belong to me. I sat still and I breathed slowly, and I thought about all the years I had let things go, all the times I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken, all the mornings I had driven 40 minutes to care for someone this same woman had not visited in nearly a year. And then I watched the judge set down her glasses, fold her hands on the bench, and look directly at the woman who had just called me a criminal. What she said in that room changed everything. But if I am honest, the truth had been building toward that moment for a very long time. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you had spent years being the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who actually showed up while everyone else watched from a comfortable distance, and then someone called you a criminal in front of a judge for the very things you had sacrificed to protect, what would you do? Would you stay quiet one more time, or would you finally let the truth speak for itself? Keep watching, because Ackles did not flinch. My name is Ackles, and I want to tell you what 11 years of loyalty, patience, and quiet sacrifice looked like when it finally stood up in a courtroom and refused to sit back down. I met my husband Daniel when I was 27 years old. He was warm and gentle and came from a family that I thought at the time was simply close-knit. I would later learn there is a specific difference between a family that is close-knit and a family that has quietly assigned roles to each of its members without ever asking permission. In this family, Daniel's sister Renata was the favored one. She was the oldest, the loudest, the one who got the biggest smiles from her parents at every holiday. And I, from the very first dinner I attended, was the newcomer who needed to prove herself worthy of the table. I want to be fair. I do not believe Renata was a monster. I believe she was a woman who had grown up being told she was the most important person in every room she entered, and she carried that belief the way someone carries a coat that is slightly too large for them. She wore it with confidence, but it never quite fit. She made decisions as though she were the head of the family, even when the decisions were not hers to make. She spoke for her parents at family gatherings without asking them first. She told Daniel what to do with his money, his time, his career, and his marriage, and Daniel, who loved his sister dearly, often listened without questioning why she had any say in the matter at all. In the early years, I told myself it was just how some families work. I told myself that once Renata got to know me, things would change. I made food for every gathering. I remembered birthdays. I sent thank you notes after holidays. I helped Daniel's mother, Lorraine, with her doctor appointments when her knees started giving her trouble. I sat with Daniel's father, Harold, on Sunday afternoons and listened to him talk about his years working in the printing industry, a subject that none of his children ever seemed particularly interested in. Harold was a quiet, methodical man who loved precision and honesty and did not say things he did not mean. I genuinely liked him, and I believe he genuinely liked me. Renata noticed. She made comments, small at first, almost passing. Things like, "You do not need to try so hard, Ackles, we're not that formal," or "My parents are used to family, not performances." I smiled and said nothing because I genuinely did not know if she was right or wrong. I was not performing, I was just being myself. But when someone repeatedly tells you that your sincere behavior is calculated, you begin to doubt which one is true. Daniel and I bought a house in the 4th year of our marriage. It was not far from his parents, which felt natural at the time. Daniel worked long hours as a project manager for an engineering firm, and I had shifted from a full-time marketing position to a part-time consulting role so that I could be more available for our household and increasingly for his parents as their health began to require more attention. This was not a decision Daniel pushed me toward. It was a conversation we had together slowly over months, and I made it freely. But I want to be clear that what I gave up was real. I gave up income, career momentum, and professional relationships that had taken years to build. I did this because it felt like the right choice for our family, and I never once asked anyone to credit me for it. Renata lived 40 minutes away and worked in insurance. She had 2 children, a husband named Gerald who I found perfectly pleasant, and a life that kept her genuinely busy. I did not fault her for not showing up as often. What I did begin to notice, slowly and then all at once, was that her absence in the practical work of caring for her parents did not prevent her from having very strong opinions about how that work should be done. She would call on a Tuesday, and by Thursday Lorraine would mention that Renata had said the physical therapist I had recommended was not the right choice, or that Renata felt Harold's medications should be reviewed by a different doctor, or that Renata thought the house needed a different cleaning service. Lorraine would say these things not to argue with me, but because she genuinely did not know what to do with the contradiction of a daughter who had opinions and a daughter-in-law who had presence. Lorraine was a gentle woman who did not like conflict. She tried to honor both at once, which mostly meant she caught the friction between us without creating it herself. Harold was different. Harold said what he thought, and what he thought increasingly was that Ackles was the one who showed up. He did not say this to cause problems. He said it because it was true, and because Harold believed that truth was something you stated clearly rather than hinted at politely. One afternoon when I brought him his blood pressure medication and a cup of tea, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, "My daughter loves me, but she loves me from a distance. You love me up close." There is a difference. I told him he did not need to say that, and he said he knew he did not need to, but he wanted to. I drove home that day and cried in the car for 20 minutes, not because I was sad, but because being seen by someone after years of feeling invisible is its own particular kind of release. The legal conversations started about 2 years before Harold died. He was 78 and his heart had been giving him quiet warnings for some time. He had a lawyer he had worked with for decades, a careful, organized woman named Ms. Petrov who managed his estate documents and property affairs. Harold called a family meeting in the spring to discuss his wishes. Daniel and I came. Renata came with Gerald. Lorraine sat at the head of the table looking as though she would rather be anywhere else. Ms. Petrov sat beside Harold with a folder and spoke in a calm, measured way about what Harold wanted. Harold had 2 significant assets beyond his savings. One was the family home on Creston Avenue, where he and Lorraine had lived for 31 years. The other was a small commercial property 3 blocks away that he had purchased in the 90s and rented to a series of small businesses over the years. The rental income was modest but consistent. Harold explained in his careful way that he wanted Lorraine to remain in the Creston Avenue house without financial burden for the rest of her life. He wanted the commercial property to be placed in a trust that would be managed by Daniel and Ackles, with the rental income going toward Lorraine's care expenses. He wanted the house to be transferred to Daniel upon Lorraine's passing, and he wanted Renata to receive a cash inheritance drawn from his savings account. Ms. Petrov had prepared everything. Harold had already signed the documents in her presence with a notary. Renata did not say anything during the meeting. She sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw tight and her eyes moving between her father and the folder on the table. When it was over and we were standing in the kitchen while Lorraine made tea, Renata said to no one in particular that she needed time to process all of this. I thought nothing of it. Processing takes time. What I did not realize in that moment was that what Renata was actually doing was beginning to construct a different version of events in her own mind. A version in which her father had been influenced, misled, or manipulated, and in which the person most likely to have done the influencing was me. Harold died 14 months later in autumn after a short hospitalization following a second cardiac event. Daniel was beside him. I had been at the hospital every day that week. Renata arrived on the second day and stayed for 3 days, and I want to be generous and say that grief affects people differently. She cried. She held her father's hand. She talked to him even when he could not respond. That part was real. Her love for him was real. I never doubted that. What I doubted was her capacity to hold both her grief and the truth of her choices at the same time, because grief can become a way of rewriting history, and some people use it more deliberately than others. In the weeks after Harold's death, Ms. Petrov moved through the estate process with the same calm efficiency that had always defined her. The commercial property trust was established. The cash inheritance was transferred to Renata's account. The house on Creston Avenue remained with Lorraine, protected by the terms Harold had specified. Everything was exactly as Harold had planned. And then, approximately 6 weeks after the funeral, Renata called Daniel and told him she had been consulting with her own attorney, and that she had reason to believe that some of the documents Harold had signed were not valid. Daniel told me about the call that night. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a glass of water, and a look on his face that I recognized as the expression he wore when he was genuinely frightened but trying not to show it. He said Renata's lawyer had questioned the timing of the trust documentation relative to Harold's mental state in his final years. He said Renata believed I had coached Harold, pressured him, or in some way influenced the outcome. He said Renata had used the word manipulation, and then he said the word I had not heard until that moment. Renata had told her attorney that the signature on one of the documents might be a forgery. I want to pause here and tell you what it feels like to be accused of forging the signature of a man you genuinely loved and respected. It does not feel like anger first. It feels like a cold, hollow opening in your chest, because some accusations are so far from who you are that your mind takes a moment to accept that someone has actually said them. I had not forged anything. I had not coached Harold, pressured Harold, or manipulated Harold. Harold had been sharper in his final years than most people half his age. Ms. Petrov had supervised every document. A notary had verified every signature. I had never once been alone with Harold when any of these papers were being discussed or signed. The entire process had been methodical and witnessed and recorded. And still, Renata had looked at the outcome of her father's choices and decided that the most logical explanation was that I had cheated her. I stayed very calm that night. Daniel was upset and I held space for his upset because he was losing his father and now losing the simple grief of that loss to something complicated and sharp. I told him that I had done nothing wrong, that the documents were real, and that if Renata wanted to pursue this legally, she would find that out. I said it without bitterness. I said it as a fact. What I felt underneath that fact was something I did not say out loud, which was that this accusation told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in Renata's version of this family. 11 years, and she still saw me as a stranger who had taken something. Renata filed a legal challenge 4 months after Harold's death. She alleged undue influence in the creation of the trust documents and questioned the validity of Harold's signature on the commercial property assignment. Her lawyer filed a motion requesting a review of the estate proceedings. Ms. Petrov's response was immediate, thorough, and devastating in its precision. She provided the original notarized documents, the dated records of every meeting in which Harold had participated, and her own sworn affidavit confirming that Harold had been lucid, deliberate, and clear at every stage of the process. She also provided the name of the notary, a man named Thomas Caraway who had worked with Ms. Petrov for 19 years, who was prepared to testify to the same. Daniel hired an estate attorney, a man named Mr. Ose who had a reputation for being methodical and unsentimental, and exactly the kind of person you want beside you when the truth is on your side but the fight is ugly. Mr. Ose reviewed everything and told us the challenge had very little legal merit but could create significant delays and emotional cost if not handled firmly. He told us to keep our documentation thorough, our communication limited to what was legally necessary, and our emotions out of the courtroom. I told him that would not be a problem. I had been keeping my emotions out of places they were not welcome for 11 years. The months leading up to the hearing were not quiet. Renata called Lorraine multiple times with her version of events. She told her mother that Ackles had taken advantage of Harold's illness. She told her the trust was unfair. She told her that Harold would not have made these choices without outside influence. Lorraine, who was 74 and grieving and not well equipped for conflict, did not push back. She listened. She cried. She told Daniel she did not know what to think. She never directly accused me of anything, but she began to pull away. Sunday dinners became uncomfortable. Phone calls became shorter. There was a particular Sunday in January when I brought Lorraine a meal I had made because she had mentioned she was tired, and when I arrived at the door she seemed surprised. Ed to see me, like she had forgotten for a moment that I was the one who still came. I continued to come, I want to say that clearly. I did not pull away from Lorraine during this period because I was angry with her. She was an old woman being fed fear by her daughter and she did not have the tools to push back. I made her meals. I drove her to appointments. I sat with her on the couch and watched the television programs she liked without talking about any of it. I did this not because I expected it to change what was happening in the legal process, but because Harold had trusted me to take care of his wife, and I was not going to let a court case change what kind of person I was. There was one afternoon in late winter that I think about often. I was sitting with Lorraine after a cardiology appointment, and she reached over without saying anything and patted my hand twice, the way older women sometimes do when words are not quite adequate. She did not explain the gesture. She did not apologize for what was happening, but the gesture meant something. It meant she knew. On some level underneath all the noise her daughter had poured into her ear, Lorraine knew who had been showing up. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of April. Mr. Ose had prepared meticulously. We had the original documents, the notary records, Ms. Petrov's affidavit, the detailed logs I had kept of every medical appointment I had attended with Harold during his final 2 years, and a collection of emails Harold himself had sent to Ms. Petrov confirming his intentions in his own words. Harold had been thorough. He had known, I think, that this moment might come. He had not said so directly, but a man who values precision does not leave loose ends by accident. The day before the hearing, Renata sent Daniel a text message. It said that she still loved him and that she hoped they could find a way through this without destroying the family. Daniel showed it to me and I read it twice. It was the kind of message that sounds like an olive branch but functions as a final attempt to put the responsibility for the conflict on the person receiving it. I told Daniel it was his decision how to respond. He wrote back and said he hoped so too. He was kinder than I might have been, but that is who Daniel is. I wore a navy blue dress to the hearing. Not because I thought appearance changed anything legally, but because Harold had once told me that he respected people who presented themselves clearly, that the way you dressed for something important was a form of saying I understand what this moment is. I thought about him when I put it on. I thought about the Sunday afternoons in his living room, the tea, the stories about the printing industry, the way he talked about precision and honesty as though they were the same thing. I wanted to carry something of him into that room. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined. These types of estate hearings do not happen in the grand rooms you see in television dramas. It was a civil courtroom with pale walls and overhead lighting and rows of seats that were mostly empty. The judge was a woman named Judge Caswell who appeared to be in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular stillness of someone who has heard a great many stories and learned to sort the true ones from the constructed ones very quickly. Renata and her attorney sat at the opposite table. Renata wore a dark jacket and had her hair pulled back. She looked composed and prepared, and I thought, looking at her, that she had fully convinced herself of her own version of events. That is not an easy thing to understand from the outside, but I had spent enough time watching how some people process their own guilt and disappointment to recognize it when I saw it. She was not lying in the sense of knowingly stating the opposite of the truth. She had built a story in which she was the wronged party, and she had told it to herself so many times that it had calcified into something she experienced as reality. That is both more frightening and more sad than ordinary dishonesty. Renata's attorney opened by presenting the challenge to the documents. He spoke about Harold's age, about his cardiac history, about the medication he had been taking in his final year, and about what he described as Ackles' unusual level of access to Harold in the period when the trust documents were signed. He implied, without stating directly, that this access had been leveraged for personal gain. He said the signature on one document appeared inconsistent with earlier signatures on file. He said the family had concerns. He said justice required a review. Mr. Osai responded without raising his voice. He placed the notarized documents on the table. He placed Ms. Petrov's affidavit on the table. He placed Thomas Carraway's signed statement on the table. He noted the date and time stamps on every document. He noted that Harold had initiated the family meeting himself, 6 months before the documents were finalized, with no prompting from any other party. He noted that Harold had sent 3 separate emails to Ms. Petrov in the 12 months before signing, each of which expressed his intentions clearly and in his own words. He then noted that the supposedly inconsistent signature had been reviewed by a certified document examiner who had found no evidence of forgery or alteration. He placed that report on the table as well. Then it was Renata's turn to speak. She had requested the opportunity to address the court directly, and Judge Caswell had allowed it. Renata stood and spoke in a voice that was controlled but carried something underneath it, a current of emotion she was working hard to manage. She talked about her father. She talked about how devoted she had been to him. She talked about how difficult his final years had been for the family. And then she turned toward our side of the room, and she said that she believed with full sincerity that the documents her father had signed did not reflect his true wishes, that he had been in a vulnerable state, and that the person who had spent the most time with him in that state had used that access to shape a legal outcome in her own favor. She did not use the word forged again in that moment, but she looked at me when she said it, and the implication was unmistakable. Judge Caswell listened to all of it without expression. When Renata finished, the judge was quiet for a moment. She picked up her glasses and put them on and looked through several pages of the documentation before her. Then she set the glasses down on the bench in front of her, not dismissively, but with the deliberate gesture of someone who has read what she needed to read and is now ready to speak clearly. She looked at Renata's attorney first and asked him to confirm the name of the document examiner who had allegedly identified the signature inconsistency. There was a pause. The attorney named a person. Judge Caswell asked for that individual's credentials in the written report. Renata's attorney said the report was in preparation. The judge asked why a report that was central to the allegation had not been filed before the hearing. There was another pause, a longer one. Judge Caswell then looked at Thomas Carraway's statement, which had been included in our submission. She confirmed aloud that Mr. Carraway was a licensed notary in good standing with the state, that he had been present at the signing, and that his statement confirmed Harold's full lucidity and voluntary participation at the time of execution. She confirmed that Ms. Petrov's affidavit corroborated this account in detail. She confirmed that Harold's own written communications expressed his intentions clearly and repeatedly over a period of more than a year. Then Judge Caswell looked at Renata directly, not at her attorney, at Renata, and she said in a voice that was not unkind but was entirely without softness, that the court had found no credible evidence to support the allegation of undue influence, no verified expert finding to support the forgery claim, and no documentation suggesting that the deceased had expressed any wish contrary to what was recorded in the estate instruments. She said the challenge lacked evidentiary foundation. She said the documents were valid and would stand. She said the estate would proceed as established. And then she said something else. She said that bringing an allegation of forgery into a probate proceeding without a verified supporting report was a serious matter, and that the court took note of the absence of that documentation. She said she hoped all parties would consider carefully before pursuing further proceedings on the basis of unsubstantiated claims. It was not a formal sanction, but it was a warning delivered in a room in front of witnesses, with the weight of a judge's voice behind it. It was the kind of statement that does not leave a room, it follows you out. Renata did not respond. She looked at the table. Her attorney made a brief closing remark that amounted to nothing in particular, and then it was over. We stood. The judge left the bench, and I sat still for a moment longer than everyone else because I needed a second to simply exist inside the truth of what had just happened. Mr. Ose leaned over and said quietly that went as well as it could have. I nodded. Daniel reached over and took my hand. I looked across the room and Renata was gathering her things. She did not look at me. I did not need her to. I had not come to that room to watch her face. I had come to tell the truth, and the truth had spoken for itself the way truth sometimes does when you give it the right documents and enough time. In the days after the hearing, the family silence had a different quality. Before, the silence had been full of tension and implication, the kind that pressures you to fill it with apologies or explanations you do not owe. After the hearing, the silence was simply quiet. Renata did not call Daniel for 2 weeks. When she did, it was about something practical, an upcoming birthday for one of her children, and the conversation was brief and careful and did not mention the hearing at all. I do not know if that silence was shame or strategy or simply the absence of the argument she had been carrying for months and no longer had the energy to maintain. Lorraine called me the week after. She asked if I would bring her to a follow-up appointment with her cardiologist. I said yes. We drove there together, and on the way back she asked me if I was angry with her. I told her I was not angry with her. I told her I understood that she had been in a very difficult position and that she had done the best she could. She was quiet for a moment and then she said she was sorry. She did not specify what she was sorry for. I think she may not have been entirely sure herself, but I accepted it because Lorraine is not a cruel woman. She is a tired, grieving woman who got swept into something she was not strong enough to resist. That is a different kind of failure and it deserves a different kind of response. The commercial property trust began operating as Harold had intended. The rental income went into the account designated for Lorraine's care expenses. Daniel managed the property affairs. I continued doing what I had always done, maintaining Lorraine's schedule, keeping track of her medical appointments, making sure she had food in the house and someone to call if something went wrong. I did not do this to prove anything. I did it because it was the right thing to do and because stopping would have made me into a different person than the one I intend to be. There is something I have thought about a great deal in the months since the hearing, which is the nature of the story Renata told herself. I have tried, as honestly as I can, to understand how a woman who loved her father could look at his carefully considered, clearly documented, legally executed wishes and decide they must be someone else's doing. I think the answer is grief. Not just grief for Harold, but grief for the version of her family she had believed in, the version where she was at the center of everything and her parents' love was primarily expressed through what they left behind. Harold's choices did not match that version. They matched the version where the person who showed up was the person who mattered. And that was a version that left Renata somewhere she had not expected to be. I do not say that to be unkind to her. I say it because understanding why people do painful things does not require excusing the pain they cause. Renata stood up in a courtroom and called me a forger. She told her mother I had manipulated a dying man. She spent months undermining my reputation in a family I had worked for years to be a genuine part of. She did all of that because she could not tolerate the truth that her father had expressed. That is real damage. It does not disappear because her motivations were rooted in grief rather than malice. 1 month after the hearing, I sat down and wrote Renata a letter, not to confront her and not to demand an apology, but because I believed there were things that needed to be said clearly between two adults rather than left to accumulate in silence. I told her that I had never worked against her father's interests or her family's integrity. I told her that I had loved Harold in the way you love someone whose mind you respect and whose presence teaches you something. I told her that I understood she was grieving and that I had no wish to make that grief harder. I also told her plainly and without anger that what she had done in that courtroom had caused real harm and that I needed her to understand that even if she never acknowledged it. I told her I did not expect her to become someone different, but I expected her to treat me with the same basic honesty she would want for herself. And I told her that my door was not closed, but that I would not pretend the last year had not happened. She did not respond to the letter for 3 weeks. When she did, she sent a short message through Daniel rather than directly to me. She said she had read it. She said she needed more time. I told Daniel to tell her that was fine, that I was not waiting on a timeline, but that I had said what I needed to say and I meant it. I do not know if Renata and I will ever fully repair what broke during that year. I am realistic about the nature of some fractures. There are breaks that heal smooth and there are breaks that heal with a ridge, and you can feel the ridge forever even if the bone holds. What I know is that I am not willing to pretend the ridge is not there. I spent too many years pretending that things were fine when they were not, telling myself that keeping the peace was the same as having peace, that being tolerated was the same as being welcomed. The courtroom stripped that pretense away, not Renata's accusations, the truth that answered them. Lorraine is doing better. Her heart is stable and she has started a gentle walking program that her cardiologist recommended. She calls me most Thursdays. We talk about ordinary things, her shows, her garden, a book she is trying to read. She told me recently that she finished one of the novels I recommended last year and that she liked it more than she expected. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Daniel and I do not talk about the hearing much. It is not something we avoid, but it is not something we need to revisit either. We went through something difficult together and we came out of it with our marriage intact and our integrity intact and a clearer sense of what we each would and would not tolerate. That is not a small thing. That is the result of two people choosing honesty over comfort in a situation where comfort was the easier path. I think about Harold often. I think about him when I drive past Creston Avenue, when I handle something related to the property trust, when I sit with Lorraine and see the framed photo of him on the bookshelf. He was a man who believed that truth was something you built over time through consistent action, that you could not manufacture credibility in a moment, that you either showed up or you did not, and that history kept an honest record regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it out loud. He was right. The documents on that courtroom table were just paper and ink. What they represented was years of showing up, years of being trusted with something real, years of earning that trust in the only way it can actually be earned. Renata had wanted the court to see me as a stranger who had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man. What the court actually saw was a notary's signature, an attorney's affidavit, and a stack of emails written in an old man's own careful words, expressing exactly what he wanted over and over again long before anyone could claim his mind had faltered. She had wanted the story to be about my access. The story turned out to be about his clarity. I am 39 years old and I have learned some things in the last several years that I think I should say plainly. Loyalty without recognition is still worth something, but it is only worth something to you, to the life you build and the person you become. You cannot rely on others to see your contributions clearly, especially when they have reasons to look away. So you document things, not out of suspicion or calculation, but because clarity is a form of care for future you when things get hard. Keep records, keep receipts, keep the emails, not because you plan to go to war, but because when war finds you anyway, you want to be able to stand in a pale-walled room and let the truth do the talking. Being the quiet one does not mean being the invisible one. I was quiet for a long time because I believed that was the gracious way to exist in a family that had not fully chosen me. I learned that grace and visibility are not opposites. I learned that sometimes the most gracious thing you can do is refuse to be erased. To stand in a room where someone is calling you a liar and to remain steady because you know what is true and you have the records to prove it. That steadiness is not coldness. It is the result of knowing yourself well enough to not need the validation of people who have already decided who you are. Renata decided who I was a long time before that courtroom. She decided I was an outsider who had found a way in. She saw every meal I cooked, every appointment I drove to, every Sunday afternoon I spent listening to her father talk about ink and paper and precision as an act of positioning rather than genuine care. She could not see past her own suspicion to recognize what was actually happening in front of her. That is her loss. It is a real one. Harold saw it. He saw it clearly. And he spent the last years of his life making sure that what he saw was documented in ink that could not be argued away. That is the real story, not the courtroom drama, not the accusations, not the legal filings. The real story is a quiet old man who valued honesty, saw it in someone his daughter had dismissed, and made sure the record reflected the truth even if it took a hearing to bring it into the light. I do not need Renata to admit she was wrong. I do not need the family to hold a ceremony of recognition. I do not need anything that I have not already earned and kept. What I have is the knowledge that when someone stood up and called me a forger in front of a judge, the paper trail left behind by an honest, clear-eyed man said otherwise. That is enough. That is more than enough. Some people wait their whole lives to be believed. I was lucky enough to be believed by someone who made sure his belief was written down. If you have ever been the one who showed up quietly, carried the weight without applause, and then had someone accuse you of the very thing you sacrificed to prevent, I want you to know that Ackles sees you. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. What did you have to finally let go of before you could stop chasing approval from people who had already decided you were not enough? Leave your answer in the comments below, because the people watching this story right now might need to hear exactly what you have learned. And if this story hit close to home, share it with one person who needs to be reminded that the truth does not need to be loud to be powerful.